The echoes of the wedding celebration had finally faded into a haunting, heavy silence. Rebecca lay motionless in the gray, pre-dawn light, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling of the bedroom she had occupied since she was a child. She pressed her face deep into the cool fabric of the pillow, muffling her ragged sobs so her parents wouldn't hear her grief from the next room. It wasn't the physical events of the wedding night that broke her spirit, but the sudden, chilling clarity that arrived with the morning sun. At 21 years old, she realized that this cycle, this surrender of her physical self, would repeat month after month, year after year, for the next 2 decades. She felt the invisible gears of a massive conveyor belt begin to grind beneath her, pulling her toward a future she hadn't chosen. She was trapped in a system where she had no information and no voice. The path was set, the momentum was unstoppable, and she had absolutely no idea how to jump off. Within 8 short weeks, the transformation was complete. Rebecca was pregnant. In the tight-knit world of her community, there were no quiet questions about her readiness or her emotional state. Instead, the air was filled with the smell of casseroles and the weight of ancient scripture. Her mother-in-law arrived with food and a quote from Genesis, while her own mother hugged her tightly, declaring that God was showering them all with his divine favor. Rebecca stood in her kitchen, only 2 months a wife and already a mother-to-be, and forced a smile because that was simply what was expected. Beneath the surface, however, she felt the walls closing in. To the community, her fertility was not a personal matter. It was a theological resource and a sacred obligation. The ancient survival instincts of the early Anabaptists had long ago calcified into a rigid, unyielding doctrine. In this world, being fruitful was not a suggestion or a choice. It was a divine command that left no room for a woman's own consent or voice. Knowledge was the first thing sacrificed at the altar of tradition, creating a profound, systemic silence. Rebecca soon realized that her husband, Daniel, was just as lost and unequipped as she was. While they were both highly capable adults who could manage a 200-acre farm, repair complex machinery, or birth a struggling calf in the middle of a freezing snowstorm, they were completely helpless and bewildered within the walls of their own bedroom. Their formal education had ended abruptly at the 8th grade, and health class, as the outside world understood it, simply did not exist. This widespread lack of understanding wasn't a coincidence or a personal failing. It was a deliberate structural choice designed to keep the community's youth in a state of perpetual innocence. Daniel knew less about human reproduction than a typical 12-year-old in the English world, not because he lacked the intelligence to learn, but because he had been intentionally shielded from the truth. In their world, 2 adults were expected to build a life together while remaining entirely ignorant of the very bodies they inhabited. Since formal medical science was strictly forbidden by the Ordnung, the women of the community were forced to turn to the shadows for answers. Rebecca began to pay closer attention to the hushed, urgent conversations that took place during quilting bees and communal kitchen frolics. While the men were outside tending to the fields, the women traded fragments of information like precious forbidden currency. They spoke in low tones about extended breastfeeding, a method they never officially named, but understood as a way to buy a few months of precious time. They also discussed dangerous days, attempting to track their cycles with a mixture of desperate hope and incomplete folklore. some sought out the hidden expertise of herbalists like Aunt Miriam, whose garden grew more than just seasoning for soup. Plants like pennyroyal and Queen Anne's lace were whispered to have the power to bring on a delayed monthly cycle. It was a clandestine world of secret desperation, where women tried to reclaim their physical autonomy using the only rudimentary tools they were allowed to possess. In a tight-knit Amish district, the community acted as a giant, unblinking eye that saw into every kitchen and bedroom. Rebecca watched the tragedy of a woman named Sarah, who had dared to seek autonomy. Sarah had secretly visited an English doctor to obtain birth control pills, a move that felt like a revolutionary act of self-preservation. However, in a world where every visit to the midwife was counted and every growing belly was monitored, a secret could not live long. When the news eventually leaked through the hushed whispers of a quilting circle, the social consequences were absolute. Sarah wasn't physically cast out or formally shunned, but a heavy, suffocating layer of shame descended upon her entire family. The bishop spoke to her husband, and the judgment of the congregation was felt in every cold shoulder and averted gaze. Rebecca watched Sarah's face in church the following Sunday. Her eyes never rose from her folded hands. She stopped taking the pills and proceeded to have 3 more children in 4 years, her spirit visibly crushed by the weight of a collective will.
The stark reality of this life was best captured not in a sermon, but on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Rebecca stood just 3 feet away, watching her mother, who was 8 months pregnant with her 9th child. Her mother gripped the edge of the wooden kitchen counter, her knuckles white, as she breathed through a sharp, sudden contraction while continuing to stir a large pot of oatmeal. There was no offer of help from the man, no sympathetic comment from the neighbors, and no acknowledgement of the physical toll. It was simply the expected rhythm of an Amish woman's existence. At 16, Rebecca had looked at that scene and felt a chilling weight settle in her chest, a feeling for which she didn't yet have a name. Later, she would realize the word was dread. It was the crushing realization that her mother's exhausted present was her own inevitable future, a path laid out before she could even speak for herself. In that kitchen, surrounded by the steam of breakfast, she saw the true cost of a theology that valued fertility over the personhood of the woman carrying the child.
At 23, Rebecca finally chose the painful path of exile, trading the only world she had ever known for a chance to breathe. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The shunning was a total wall of silence, with letters returned unopened and her own mother's voice snatched away for years. Yet, 6 weeks after stepping into the English world, she found herself sitting in a quiet pharmacy parking lot in Lancaster County. She held a small, inconspicuous paper bag containing her first prescription, and for the first time in her adult life, she wept out of pure, overwhelming relief. In that moment, wearing clothes that still felt like a borrowed costume, the crushing weight of the conveyor belt finally stopped. She understood that reproductive autonomy was not merely a medical choice. It was the fundamental recognition of her own personhood. Her life was no longer a script written by a theology she had no voice in choosing. Rebecca realized that her body was finally, legally, and spiritually her own. The long, silent journey from the gray dawn of her wedding night had finally led her to the most sacred rite of all, the power to decide.